College complexes. This is our 440th meeting since we started in February 2009. We put a speaker on every week, a different subject. We require our speaker to take a position on an issue or express a point of view. They have to be for or against something. We don't care what it is. We give our speaker up to an hour to make a presentation. If they go over an hour, we cut them off. If anybody interrupts the speaker, we remind the interrupter, we listen only one fool at a time. It's one of our rules. Then we have questions and answers from the audience of the speaker. Then we have remarks, rebuttals. Everybody in this audience that wants to gets 5 minutes at the podium here to respond to what the speaker said, for or against. And the speaker gets the last word, gets a comment, close the meeting. That's how it works. But before we introduce our speaker, we have time for announcements. Anybody have any announcements they want to make? Now's the time to do it. Got any announcements?
No, well, maybe,
Well, come on, make it.
well, I mean, all right. All right, we're gonna have, Philosopher's Forum's gonna have, I think the guy's name is Pankaj Jain, Indian guy, doing our first talk on January 8th, I believe, which is the second Tuesday of January. So, and he's going to be talking about something to do with India. I don't recall exactly what it is, and I have to post the schedule yet. But anyway, so everybody's welcome to come. It's $5. Show up about 6. You get to eat and have some scintillating conversation.
Tell me a little bit more. 6 o'clock on a Tuesday.
Any other announcements? Now's the time.
Where?
Get out of your
So
system.
Phoenix, on the Skillman of India. She knows where it is.
One of the restaurants, I think it's up there.
Philosophy.
Anyone have any announcements you want to make? No, now's the time. Speak now, hold your peace. Anyway, December 22nd and 29th, the next 2 weeks, we won't have a meeting here. It's Christmas and New Year's. So our next meeting will be January 5th. On January 5th, we have Dr. Chris Bolt. They'll be talking on looking seriously at life extensions. It's on your itinerary. I'm not going to read all this. January 12th, find common ground or hate will destroy our democracy. That's Calvin Bluett. He's a government professor. On January 19th, I had it here, it will be Chris Muldrow. I forget what he's talking about. You have somebody has that sheet. Anyway, January 26th, secular humanism, the best alternative religion. That's on your also. For tonight, I got one other thing to mention that I want to mention. You probably all know it. We have Black Forest cake, so don't eat too much. We have you get a free dessert tonight, so that's good. Anyway, it's on us. So our speaker tonight is Dr. Paul Benson. He's going to talk about cult of saints and relics, medieval martyrs and miracles. He's a professor of humanities at Mountain View College. He'll present a microhistory of the Middle Ages, obsession with saints, relics, martyrs, shrines, miracles, and pilgrimages. He will argue that the relic cult obsession got out of hands and became the center of deception, fraud, and manipulation. From St. Anthony's fire to St. Francis' stigma, many medieval people came to believe that close contact with a saint's blood, body, hair, or even clothes had an extraordinary beneficial value. They held the hope that veneration of even the smallest part of a saint's body, such as a fingernail, might bring forth a miracle or reduction in time in purgatory for the individual giving veneration, or for a close relative of that individual, such as a parent or child. Elaborate shrines were constructed for the repose of those saints, and pilgrimages to the sites became one of the central religious activities in Europe prior to the Reformation. So without further ado, please give a very, very warm welcome to our speaker, Dr. Paul Benson.
Could you get that door shut?
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom, and thank you all. It's wonderful to be back with friends. This is my 5th round at college complexes. So we are greatly blessed to be in in the presence of such deep and interesting people who like to talk and think about things. I'm used to talking to students who would rather not know anything, and so it's really refreshing. I have always, and I don't have any idea why, been fascinated with the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages are just astoundingly fascinating. Some of the most important things in history happened in the Middle Ages. I'll mention just one. The rise of higher education, the beginning of the university. The first university was in about 1068 in Bologna, Italy. And this is an extraordinary, important event, which doesn't get a lot of press because people take the whole idea of university education for granted and higher education for granted, and yet this is one of the premier contributions of the Middle Ages. So these people talk about the Dark Ages. This always seems to me very odd in a way, because the Middle Ages are rich, rich period, rich time, and I want to get into that with you tonight. Talk about what happened and why it happened, and how the whole relic racket got totally out of control. I want to start with this story to illustrate, first of all, the importance of one relic and how it impacts our life even today. All right? If you've heard this story, I apologize, but I think most of you may not have heard the story of a Roman soldier who was kind of interested in Christianity. This is back in the 4th century in France. Of course, it wasn't called France then. It was called Gaul. And it was the domain, one of the important Roman settlements in Europe. And this young man was an officer. Now, you have to stop right there and point out something. To be an officer back in the Middle Ages, by definition, you were royalty. Keep that in mind. You will be hard pressed to find from the Romans to the Renaissance. Be very hard pressed to find any military officer who's not royalty. And nowadays, you know, where you get into become an officer by the fact you've had an extraordinary education, right? But in the old days, you couldn't get the education because you couldn't. Everything was for the whole system is geared for the royals. Anyway, this young man was a leader of a patrol, and every night they would leave and go out and patrol the area. They had a regular route they went on. And one December night, it was very, very cold. Nobody wanted to go. But they had to go, so they were trying to get out before the gate closed. The gate would close at sundown, and that time of the year, that would be about 4:30. And so they were trying to get back to the gate, through the gate, and do their patrol while it was still light. So they go out and they come back, and before they had left, they all put on a piece of cloth that was lined on one side with wool. And they would they would just kind of stick it over their head and tuck it around their neck, trying to cover the back of their neck, and kind of tuck it in like this. And this would, think if you will, please, of a hoodie, right? So you're cold. If you have a hoodie, you pull it over and you tie it. Well, this is a piece of, this looks very much like a hoodie, but what was called is a chapa. C-H-A-P-A, chapa. So they would put on the chapa, and in this occasion, they all had their chapas on. So if you saw them riding along, it looked like they had a little almost like a pointed hat. So as they're coming back toward the gate, medieval gates were important because everybody had to go through the gate, right? So if you were a soldier, or if you were a common person, you would have to go through the gate to get into the city. If you lived in the city, you'd have to do this during the daylight hours. Well, anyway, they came back to the gate, and the soldier, the officer, I should say, was very taken by the fact that there were beggars lined up at the gate. This was a common thing. Nowadays, beggars will stand at a corner with a cardboard sign, right? But in those days, they would just stand at the gate with their hands out, hoping somebody will put a little money into it. And they were very, shall we say, cold. And yet, this was the only way they were going to get money. So when you went to a medieval gate, you'd often see people selling things, and you would see these beggars. Well, this one beggar was standing there and just shaky. And so the officer something came over him, and he said, oh, he just felt so sorry for this man. So he stopped the patrol, and the soldiers behind were very unhappy. Cavalry, I should say. They were very unhappy because they wanted to get back. They had been out quite a long time. They were all cold. But anyway, he stopped while they waited, and he went over to the man, and he took off his chapa, pulled it off, pulled out his sword, and cut it in half. And he handed half of the chapa to this beggar. The beggar immediately puts it on and stops shaking. Well, that was the end of that. So he gets back in the horse and leads the men back to the barracks, and he goes to sleep. That night, he dreams that the man he has seen in the churches, he's visited the church, the man on the cross, was wearing his chapa. So he wakes up the next morning, and he's just transformed by this dream. So he goes, finds a church, and he tells the priest the story, and he says, will you baptize me? The priest says, well, let me ask you some questions and things. And so he did. And so the officer quit the military and decided to become a religious person. Ultimately, he became a priest, and ultimately he spent his life helping people, doing good works, and became actually quite well known. And so much so that when he died, people would come from all over to see his chapa. In other words, his half of the chapa, because this was a relic then associated with Jesus, and so they wanted to see the chapa. So this was not so much the case before he died, but after he died, people came by the thousands to see and touch the chapa. And of course, this became a little bit of a problem in his hometown, which is Tours, France. So they had to build a little building connected to the church so that all the people coming to see the chapa would not be disturbed by seeing this man, by trying to touch the chapa. And so this became a great tradition to have a little building that was connected to the church, connected to the cathedral, but was separate, right? So they called the place where they kept the sacred chapa the chapel, right? So the word chapel comes from the place where the chapa was honored. And what they wanted to do is touch it. And we'll come back to why that's so important. So there were special priests who were responsible for taking care of the chapa. And they were known as chaplains. Now, this famous military officer, of course, was named Martin. And so after he died, he became Saint Martin of Tours. Yes. Now, what's interesting about this story is how it starts to spin now and take on a life of its own. So, in the Roman Catholic Church in those days, everything had to be said in Latin. Anything in the service was entirely in Latin. The priest did the Mass in Latin. And so things that were associated with the church were called, were always done in Latin. Well, when this became so important that they used the Latin word for chapa, which is cappa or capella, and so capella became then the religious term for the chapel. And so they would, when they went into the chapel, they didn't have the organ that you would see in every cathedral in Europe. So when they sang their songs, they had to sing them without the accompaniment of the organ. So the expression for this became a cappella, which means in the manner of the chapel. And by the way, the word cap, seeing you wear the baseball cap reminds me, see, kappa is Latin.
And I'm not a capuchin.
And you're not a capuchin. By the way, they called the capuchin because they were these Italian monks who wore these little these hoodies, basically. You know, they'd have this hood they pulled over, and so they called them capuchin. And in 1492, when Columbus was on his first voyage, they landed in the New World on the islands, and he saw these monkeys. And these monkeys, the hair went up to kind of a little bit of a point. And he says, well, they're capuchins. So the term capuchin monkey became into the lectionary. And so you have that. Then you also have the signifying of various groups, such as in France, women, particular, this could be a man, but women in particular who were responsible for taking care of children were designated by wearing a little pointed hat, right? And the word for that in French is chaperon. Now you remember that English is a combination of what two languages? German and French together. So we have that as an English word, chaperon. And so the famous French children's story called Little Red Riding Hood, you see in French, it's Little Red Riding Chaperon. See, chaperon is the word for the hood. So, and then in Italy, there were these monks who wore as their costume this little pointed hood thing, and were known as the capuchin. And so they, locally, when they were making up, experimenting, making different kinds of coffees, they came up with one that was so thick with milk and cream and coffee that it whipped up into a little point. And so they called it, in Italian, cappuccino. Cappuccino is, it would be the Italian version of that. Well, anyway, here is the rest of the story. So, St. Martin was so beloved and so appreciated because many had gone to his relic and touched it and had been healed and had been cured of this and that. So, St. Martin, what happened is he became the patron saint of France. And as the patron saint of France, they would always go to St. Martin when they were in trouble. For example, during the Black Death, they went to pray to St. Martin that he would end the Black Death. Well, this goes on, became a very traditional thing, to take a pilgrimage to his church in Tours. Well, anyway, World War I broke out, 1914. So the French people would go by the thousand every day. Please intervene, if you will, St. Martin, and bring an end to this horrible war. And they would do this day after day after day. But the war goes on, 1914, 1915, 1916, 1917, finally 1918. It finally ends. Now, if you know the end date of the First World War, you know that it's the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. Now, to us, this is kind of a random thing. It just happens to be 11/11/11, and we have our Veterans Day on this day, right? But for the French, this is not a random number, because 11/11/11 is the exact hour, the exact day, and the exact month that St. Martin died. He died, and the war died on 11/11/11. And so they were like flabbergasted by the fact that St. Martin was intervening on their behalf to end World War I. We got to get that over soon if we can. Now, all this to point out something. This is just one relic, right? Mm-hmm. But this is a relic that had enormous implications, and the fact that Martin was a military man, that his priests were very much involved in military affairs. That's how the term chaplain then became associated with the military.
Okay.
Now I want to talk to you about how I think Relics got started. Wait for everybody to get settled here. Probably the earliest relic that I could come up with has to do with the oldest piece of literature in the Western world, which is what famous poem? Anybody want to take a shot at the oldest piece of Western literature we have and what it is? It's a poem, very long poem.
But the Iliad?
No.
The Iliad?
The Iliad by Homer, yes. The Iliad, of course, the story of the Trojan War. Now, here is what happened when Achilles finally died. They had a beautiful tomb for him in Troy. And this tomb was visited by people down through the ages, and they wanted to touch the armor. If you could have the armor, touch the armor of Achilles, that would be just a fantastic thing. And so they came. Well, anyway, about 300 and some years before the time of Christ, Alexander came on his way to conquer Persia and all the way to India and Egypt. You know all of that story. Well, anyway, Alexander reasoned that if he could get the armor of Alexander the Great, that he would be invincible. And so, here's what he did. He came within range of Troy and the tomb. And of course, we'd love to know where that tomb is today. But he came and he stripped down naked. And he ran all the way to Achilles' tomb naked. And there, he took the armor from Achilles and he put it on. And after that, I think you'd have to agree, he was invincible. Never defeated in battle. Although he fought, the next 10 years, one battle right after the other. It's just an extraordinary thing, right? Well, anyway, what I think is that there's this concept, which we'll talk about some more. The idea that touching the relic somehow gives you a blessing or gift of some kind. It's this idea that proximity, by being in the proximity, by being close to a relic, that somehow it has power, and that power is going to somehow come to you. This is a amazing concept. So anyway, over the years, relics of one kind or another were used, and of course, we start to see this then grow into a huge kind of cottage industry in Europe. The whole business of promoting relics and promoting the saints that are associated with relics. It's a way of reinforcing the faith of the people. Now, there were three kinds of relics. The first class of relic is it could be anything like a material item, or a piece of something like a piece of hair, a tooth, clothing, so on, would be associated with Jesus and Mary, or any of the apostles. These are considered first-class relics. So if you have a first-class relic, this has real great power. Then they have the second-class relic, which were touched by one of the apostles, or later one of the saints. For example, Saint Martin is, if it's something that he had, in other words, in this case, a piece of his, something that he wore, the chapa, that then became a second-class relic. So if it's touched by the saint, even if you just wore the shoes, for example, that would be a second-class relic. The third-class relic is, if you can imagine this, it's an item that has touched a relic, right? One of the first or second class relics. See, this is why it's so kind of confusing in a way. Almost anything could be a relic. For example, if you had a bone, say pick somebody like, say, Mark, Luke. If you had a bone of Luke, you could take the bone, you could pour oil over it, and then catch the oil. The oil had touched. So now the oil becomes a third class relic, right? So this is a pretty broad definition, a pretty expansive definition of what a relic is. And then what added to this, the Roman Catholic Church declared in 787 that every altar in every church had to have a relic. And so this was really important, because now all of a sudden they all have to go and find relics, right? And you know, this is long before DNA, right? So how do you authenticate? How do you prove? Yeah, that the relic is really truly important. Now here's an interesting thing. In Roman Catholic Mass, you have to the wine and the blood are transformed into the body and blood of Jesus. Now, the key thing here is blood, because blood is one of the most important substances for the ancient concept of libation. Now, I want to stop here for a minute and talk about libation. Now, what is a libation? A libation is a liquid, or it could be a material item that can be destroyed by either pouring it into the earth or by throwing it into the earth. So example, flour, for example. Flour could be a libation, because if the flour hits the earth, basically it's not any good anymore. If you take a bottle of wine, uncork it, and you pour it into the earth, that's a libation. Now, in the old concept, a libation is a sacrifice that was painful. In other words, you would have liked to take that bottle of wine and to have a drink from that bottle, right? But instead, you pour it out. Now today, wine is so cheap that it's hard for us to relate to this, but wine was quite expensive in ancient days. So you would take wine and you would pour it out, and that would be to the gods for either a sin you had committed, or to get a benefit from the gods, to propitiate the gods, to make them happy, this kind of thing. So what happens in the Roman Catholic service, in my way of thinking, is it's transformed into the blood of Jesus, right? And then where does that blood of Jesus go? It's drunk by the priest. See? Historically, this has changed now somewhat, but historically only the priest drank the wine, under the theory that the wine very easily dropped. One drop of wine, well, that's the blood of Jesus there on the floor. It's kind of hard to clean up. Whereas with the bread, what they did, if you've been to Mass, they place it on the tongue. Very, very hard for the bread to fall if it's being placed on the tongue.
And you have a little deal underneath your chin.
Yeah, and then they have that's right, so the little metal, there's a name for that. Pat. Yeah, little plate. But here's the thing, anything left over after the Mass had to be put in a locked box on the altar or next to the altar, called the tabernacle. And only the priest has the key, you see. And then he would open that tabernacle and take out some of the blood of Jesus and the body of Jesus to take out to somebody who was sick in the hospital and give them communion. See? But the reason I'm making this connection, that the wine, in a sense, is turned into a relic because it has the blood. You see, the most valuable, I think, of all of the relics was the true cross of Jesus, because the true cross of Jesus had his blood on it. And that's why, that makes it very special. By the way, the true cross of Jesus was found, now I put this in quotation marks for you, was found by Helena, who became a saint. Does anybody know who Helena's son was? Constantine, yes. So Constantine, of course, was this most important of all emperors from the standpoint of Christianity, because Constantine was raised in the traditional Roman religion. He practiced the traditional Roman religion, but his mother was a Christian. And I think Constantine, this is personal theory, was kind of a mama's boy, and whatever mom wanted, mom got. And mom wanted for the church to be supreme. And Constantine was willing and able to support the church with money, sent his mother off to Jerusalem, where she built that fantastic Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And Helena also, I think, was very responsible for what's called the Nicene Creed. Christians were arguing and fighting and having a very controversial time leading up to the time of Constantine. And Christians who supposedly practiced the religion of peace were fighting cats and dogs over doctrine. And so I think this is what happened is Helena said to his son, you have the power now to call together all the church leaders, and what you should do is get them together and have them hammer out a doctrine that all Christians can believe in. In other words, to create orthodoxy. And Constantine liked the idea because he didn't like this idea that Christians were fighting and conflicting with one another anyway. So he agreed to it and called this in 325 AD, this Great Church Council at Nicaea. And the idea was to establish once and for all, is Jesus the Son of God, or is Jesus God? Is Jesus somebody sent by God, or is in fact Jesus God? This, ladies and gentlemen, was the big issue separating Christians. And there were large numbers of people, quite a big chunk of Christianity, who believed that Jesus was sent by God to bring salvation to the world and to die on the cross, but was not in fact God. And then, of course, what we think of today as the Orthodox position is that Jesus is the Son of God and the Holy Spirit, all in one. Most Christians think of this as monotheism because it's all unified. God has these functions, these what's called sometimes the persons of the Trinity, but the idea is it's all one. So fundamentally, you see, if Jesus is God, then this has all kinds of implications of how the religion would proceed. So they meet, all the great church leaders, and they know what's on the line here. But how are they going to compromise between this position, between those who believe Jesus is God and those who believe Jesus is sent by God? Well, they meet all summer and they finally come to a conclusion, call in Constantine and say, we have a statement. What is the statement? The statement is, Jesus is God, 100%. Okay, but they add this, but Jesus is also 100% man, human being. Now, at the face of it, that sounds absurd. How can you be God and man at the same time? But that became the orthodox position. The Nicene Creed is still followed by all mainline Christians to this day. And the most important part of it, established once and for all, the idea that Jesus is God. And there are only a few Christian groups that don't accept that. The most prominent are probably the Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, who believe Jesus and God are separate, as well as Jehovah's Witnesses, who believe that Jesus was sent by God, but don't believe that Jesus is God. But other than those groups, most Christians accept the concept that Jesus is God. Now this, of course, led to a really interesting problem. If Jesus is God, who is Mary? See? So then they had to call another church council, the council at Ephesus. The answer to the question is, who is Mary? Is Mary the mother of God, or is Mary the mother of Jesus? So they grapple with this, and they hammer out another position of orthodoxy, and that is that Mary is mother of God. If you know anything about Roman Catholicism, you know one of the great devotional pieces of the church is the Rosary. And the Rosary is recited by some people every day. And then traditionally the Rosary societies would get together on Friday evening. Anyway, the way the Rosary starts is this: Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Hail Mary, Mother of God. Okay? Now you say, how can Mary be Mother of God? Well, this is part of the great mystery, right? This is part of the complexity of understanding the Orthodox position. The Orthodox position is that when Mary gave birth to Jesus, he was fully God. Therefore, the problem was this: if she gave birth to God, then she could not have sin. So they evolved the doctrine known as the Immaculate Conception. Immaculate Conception means that Mary was born without sin. That's an amazing concept. So Jesus is born without sin. That's an Immaculate Conception. But Mary is born without sin. So now you have one ordinary human being who was born without sin. And that's again, Catholic Orthodoxy. I would say over the years, when the Reformation came along, this idea that Mary gave birth to God seemed a little bit preposterous. And so most Protestants do not subscribe to that doctrine. But Roman Catholics, by the way, Greek Orthodox still use this word in Greek, as do the Russian Orthodox. Theotokos. Theotokos. Theo, of course, means God. Tokos means to bear. That Mary bore God. See? Theotokos. And this is, you talk about a powerful word in the Orthodox world. It's Theotokos. Now, first of all, we have to get to the bottom of why people were so willing, so obsessed with these relics and what the relics would do for them. So you have to understand a fundamental Roman Catholic doctrine of purgatory. Purgatory is the place people go between death and heaven, to have their sins purged. Get it? Purgatory, purged. So they go to this place, and it's not such a terrible place. Nothing like heaven, of course. But I always like to make the analogy between Texas in August and purgatory. You can survive it, but you'd rather not, right? And so that's the kind of thing. Purgatory is the place you want to get out. So the church evolved this doctrine of indulgences. Indulgences are pardons. Pardons for time spent in purgatory. Now, the time you spend in purgatory is undetermined, right? Is 1,000 years a long time, or is it 100 years, or is it 1,000,000 years? In other words, it's always a question of how much time you're going to have to spend in purgatory. Now, Tom and I will be quite a long time in purgatory, but there are some people here that are just kind of fly through, right?
Yeah, we believe you, doctor.
Yeah, you know I speak the truth. So anyway, what happened then is the idea of indulgences gets tied to relics, right? So if you can get to a relic, now you have something, right? Now, there's a whole bunch of relics that I'd like to talk about. One that I want to mention has a strange history. And this is a relic called the Holy Lance, sometimes called the Holy Spear. This is the spear the Roman soldier put in the side of Jesus, and out comes water and blood, which people presume that hit the heart sac, right? And out comes the blood, out comes the water. And the Holy Lance then is obviously one of the most important relics because it has the blood of Jesus, right? Always go back to the blood of Jesus. Remember, libation. Because Jesus, in shedding his blood, let's have this discussion with people about the concept of shedding the blood. First of all, how much blood does it take for the redemption, the salvation, for the atonement of the people of the world? How much blood did it take? Did it take a pint, a quart, a gallon? Or did it take one drop? So one would assume it didn't take very much. Maybe one drop was enough. But Jesus brought the salvation because his blood was shed as a libation up there on Mount Moriah, right next to the temple. You see, where every day they're shedding blood. Because this is such a fundamental part of Judaism at that time, that you shed the blood of animals to pay for human sins, right? And so when Jesus' blood is shed, he is with, up there on Mount Moriah, with Pilate. And Pilate, of course, has the Roman soldiers whip him, cat o' nine tails. And so Jesus loses an enormous amount of blood that goes into the earth there on Mount Moriah, which is the very same place where all those animals are sacrificed every day. And then most particularly on Passover, where 100,000 or more sheep, little lambs were sacrificed, right? So you have this notion then that the blood is powerful. And the spear, which has the blood of Jesus on it, therefore must be very, very important. But anyway, as with so many relics that are important, there are multiple copies, right? So there are somewhere between 4 and 6 Holy Spirits. Churches around Europe that claim to have the Holy Spirit. One of those, though, wasn't in a church. It was in a museum in Vienna. Now, as a young art student in Vienna, a young man by the name of Adolf Hitler came and saw the Holy Lance. And he was mesmerized by the Holy Lance and this idea of all the power it has. So later, I think 1938, if I believe, he is willing to take the military and invade Austria. But of course, he doesn't really have to because so many of the Austrians are German speaking. By the way, did you know that when Germany was unified back in the 1800s by Otto von Bismarck, that Otto von Bismarck made 2 incredible promises. Otto von Bismarck, who was the guy that unified Germany, but he said, I will not take Austria, because Austria is going to cause trouble. And so he called his Germany Little Germany. And with Austria, it'd be the big Germany, right? And Otto von Bismarck said these 2 things. He said, one, he said, if Germany does not get its act together, 20 years after my death, Germany will fall and be defeated. He died in 1898. 20 years later, 1918, Germany falls. He also said that the next great war would come from some tragic act in the Balkans. You remember Ferdinand assassinated in Sarajevo in the Balkans. That is an incredible prophecy, right? But anyway, Bismarck, the thing is that Hitler wanted to invade Austria, first of all, to bring it into Germany, but I would say secondarily, to get his hands on the Holy Lance. Just in the same way Alexander the Great got a hold of that armor, the armor of Achilles. And sure enough, as soon as he gets there, where does he go? He goes to the museum and he gets the Holy Lance. And the Holy Lance stays in his possession. And victory after victory after victory for the next, 4 years or so, until he hit the Russian winter. And so he was a believer. You know, Hitler was quite an occultist. I'm sure you've heard that before. So anyway, the war in April, Hitler dies. The lance falls into the hands of the Americans. Guess who got the Holy Lance? None other than George Patton. So George Patton got the lance, but Patton, to his great credit, said, you know, this is a very dangerous thing, and he immediately put it back to where it had come from, in the museum in Vienna. Now, all of that to explain that relics continue to have this impact on our lives, even though we don't think of it that way, right? In other words, would Hitler have invaded Austria? How strong was that? Hitler wasn't much of a Christian, but he believed in all of these power, these symbolic things. There was a famous, same story, that Luke had made a painting of Mary. And this painting ended up in a church called St. Mary Major in Rome. And this painting, which I'm not sure it's still there, but the painting, what kind of relic would it be? If you had one of the apostles
Second class.
paint, yeah, it'd be second class, I believe. But that's, it's extraordinary. Actually, it might even be first because by painting it, he touched it. See, Luke did, and that might make it a first class relic. Of course, we all know the story of the Holy Grail, right? Lots of this idea that, which is kind of gruesome, that Joseph of Arimathea collected the blood of Jesus and kept it in this special container called the Holy Grail. And the whole cycle of Arthurian romances in the 12th century were based on this concept, the blood of the Holy Grail. There was the Holy Sponge. The Holy Sponge ended up in a church in Rome called Santa Croix of Jerusalem. Santa Croix of Jerusalem meant this. Not that they had the Holy Cross of Jerusalem, but they had the holy dirt. Can you imagine they went to this trouble? They brought back shiploads of dirt from Jerusalem and then just covered the floor of the church with it. And that, of course, was considered that, so they considered they were in Jerusalem because they had the dirt of Jerusalem, right? And anyway, in that church they had the Holy Sponge. This is the sponge that was lifted to the lips. So now you have a sponge that has the saliva on it of Jesus, you see. Now, this just goes on and on and on. What they did all over Europe is built what they call blood shrines. Now, blood shrines were basically cathedrals where they'd have a special shrine that would have some kind of blood. Often it would be a cross, a piece of the cross. And the cross is, the whole thing about the cross is fascinating because there are thousands of churches that claim to have the cross. Well, you could cut it up in little pieces, of course, and you would have all of these pieces of the cross everywhere. John Calvin said, there are enough pieces of the cross to build a pretty good ship. And so the Catholic Church got very incensed at that. So they sent around a team of people to weigh all the pieces of the cross they could find. So they went church after church that claimed to have pieces of the cross. And it ended up to be about 4 pounds. So from a pretty good ship to 4 pounds of wood, it's quite a difference. But it just gives you an idea. For example, Westminster Abbey, very famous, of course. That's a blood shrine, right? Canterbury became a blood shrine, once Thomas à Becket was declared a saint. And very, very strange saint, by the way. This is something I cannot figure out. You have some of the most kind of reprehensible people. The famous Vikings. The Vikings were not very, shall we say, diplomatic. They just came into your community and unless you just went out and begged them and gave them all your money and everything, they just came in and started slashing away and raping and pillaging and plundering and so forth. One of those guys one of the Vikings went to the great Viking settlement in France known as Normandy. The thing to remember about France, the northern part of it, from France north to the coast, is all the Vikings they settled. And it was the Vikings living there about 200-300 years start speaking French, and it was those Vikings that then invaded England, right? If you think about the battle for England in 1066, it's really two different groups of Vikings fighting one group of Germans. The Anglos and the Saxons, of course, had been in England for about 500 years. And then these Vikings, they won it. So one comes, named Harold. This would be the half-brother of the famous Saint Olaf. He was defeated by the Anglo-Saxons. And then the Anglo-Saxons were, when at the Battle of Hastings, won up against Wayne the Conqueror, this great Viking / Norman invader, and they lost. So England, after that, of course, was required to speak French. So in the cities, London, everybody had to speak French. And but out in the countryside, they were still speaking German. And they traded back and forth and intermarried, and this thing went on and on. And eventually, English and French fused together to such a point it becomes a new language, right? And so, as English speakers, we're constantly speaking two languages at the same time.
You mean German and French?
German.
German and French.
German and French.
Blending to become English.
That is correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. German and French, because what happened, if you think about English, all the basic words are German. Like if you say, we ate tonight, we walked, we jumped, we ran, we looked. All the basic words are German. By the way, all the swear words in English are German. All the four-letter words. See, the French is beyond them, to say such crude things. But not for the Germans. Which is ironic because, only 200 years before this, France and Germany are the same place, right? It's called Francia or Francia, depending on your pronunciation, whether you're French or German. And the Franks, right? The Franks. The Franks were any of these Germanic people that lived in what is today Germany and what is today France. So when the Crusaders came back, when they went to the Holy Land, no matter where you were from, if you were from Poland, Norway, they called you a Frank. In other words, they called all the Arab Saracens, and they called all the Europeans Franks, right? So when they brought back this incense that we associate so much with Christmas, it's called frankincense, meaning it's the incense of the Franks. It's not their incense at all. They just went over and brought it back. But the name Frank gets so associated with that. Well, anyway, so when the French came in, first, number one, royalty, everything's French. The military is entirely controlled by the French, and so they are speaking French. So every military term that we have to this day is French, right? You start with private, go all the way up to general, right? Like, think of the word colonel. C-O-L-O-N-E-L. See, how can you pronounce it? Colonel. But we say colonel, right? Where did the R come from? I'll tell you where it came from. It comes from German. It's the attempt to anglicize, that is to say, to make sound German. Make it sound German. So we say colonel. And, a foreigner goes, how do you get that from that? And we have lots of words like that are French words that we try to make it sound German. So, to oversimplify, many of the sophisticated words that we use, like, say a word like, she has good intuition. We're going to have a little rendezvous over at Starbucks. The rendezvous, intuition, sophistication. All these words are French. So the French tend to be the more sophisticated, the more bread and butter words, everyday words. I like to tell the story of the farmer in England and his wife. It's about January, and they're standing out in the barnyard. By the way, barn, German, yard, German. Husband means the house bondsman, right, is German. And they're standing out, and the husband says, some of these pigs are getting really old. And the wife says, yeah, we need to do something about that. And then the wife kind of brightens up and she says, I got an idea. Why don't you kill the old sow? You kill that pig, and if you do that and slaughter it today, I'll cook you some pork chops tonight. Right? Now, in one sentence, she said, if you kill the old pig, I'll cook you some pork chops tonight. Right? You get it? In other words, as long as it's an animal, dirty out there, outside, but as soon as it comes inside and it's turned into food, it becomes pork. See? Get it? Outside, German. Inside, French. And the same is true. I mean, think about beef, right? Nobody says in English, let's go have some pig tonight. Maybe it's some kind of weird joke, but nobody ever said that. And no hillbilly in Arkansas would say, let's eat pig. No. Or the same with, they don't say, let's have a cow. No, let's have some beef. Let's eat a sheep. No, mutton, right? And just on and on. I was talking to Jerry about you have deer. Nobody says, let's eat deer. Let's have venison. See, venison's French. You go on and on and on and on like that, right? Well, anyway, what I wanted to tell you about is this Westminster I mentioned was a blood shrine. Westminster is the royal section of London, right? In other words, only the royals would meet there. And to be there, you had to have either official business or you had to be royal, right? So anyway, they built, there was a very, very famous military order in the Middle Ages known as the Knights Templar. And the Knights Templar, just inside Westminster, there was a little moat, a little body of water that separated Westminster from London. You know, the word Westminster means west, the west side of the city. And so the famous Knights Templar with their circular church was just inside because every Knights Templar was what? Royalty, right? Aristocrats. So anyway, when the Catholic Church decided to wipe out the Knights Templar, the Knights, they gave those buildings to the lawyers in England are called barristers and solicitors, right? And in those days, you had to study with a lawyer or a solicitor to learn the trade, right? But once you became good enough that you could enter the law courts, the courts are all in Westminster, right? So there was a separation of water, but across it was a little bridge called ready for this? A bar. And so when you made it into the legal profession, you were allowed to cross the bar into Westminster to go into the courts, which was the Inn of Court, or technically Inns of Court, where they carried on their legal work. And this is, of course, another whole subject, the Knights Templar. But the Knights Templar, they were then responsible through their demise for this, the Lord is to be there, and this term, crossing the bar. So today, somebody will say, you pass the bar. See, in the old days, that meant pass over the bar. Now today, it means you pass the bar test, right? So education has replaced this going across the water. Not very much water, you know, just a little bit of water, but you had to cross over. I want to talk to you and keep me posted on time now. About 5, good.
Can you have an extra 5?
Yeah.
Okay, 10.
All right. So I want to talk to you about two very famous relics. One is called the Mandelion. The word Mandelion means holy face, right? Now here's the story. This is a whopper, right? But again, we just listen to these stories, and there's truth, and that's fine. There was a king named Abgar, A-B-G-A-R, Abgar of Edessa. Edessa is way over in what would today be Syria. And he had heard there was this miracle working man down in the Holy Land, and he was in desperate need of a cure because he had somehow contacted leprosy. So, according to the story, King Abgar writes Jesus a letter. Dear Jesus, heard you do miracles. Please come and heal me as soon as possible. You're very kindly King Abgar. Obviously, I'm compressing that letter a little bit, right? So Jesus gets the letter, and he eventually sends Thaddeus, who in fact does heal the king. But when King Abgar has this letter sent, in those days, you know, there's no post office. You have to have a message delivered. So King Abgar sends with him a man to do a painting of Jesus so King Abgar can see what he looks like. That painting is the medallion. In other words, the holy face, right? So this becomes a very, very famous icon. And the Mandelion, you know, has a long history. There are really 3 of these. The Mandelion, the Shroud of Turin, and one I'm going to talk about now called the Veronica. Now the Veronica, it may in fact be the Mandelion. This is very, very controversial. But here is the story of the Mandelion, of the Veronica. So the Veronica comes about when Jesus is carrying his cross. He's carrying his cross in the Via Dolorosa, the way of sorrow. And you have the stations of the cross. Well, one of those stations is this young lady sees Jesus. The sweat and the blood are just pouring down. He can hardly see, his eyes are all covered up. And he just looks miserable. So just in pity, just kind of instantly, she pulls out her handkerchief and she goes up to him and hands it to him, and he stops and wipes off his face. And what he says we don't know, but he hands her back the handkerchief. So she doesn't think anything about it, but when she gets home, there's eventually time to, you know, wash up some things. So she's going to take this handkerchief and have it washed. But she looks on it, and there's the face of Jesus. Now this is really a powerful relic, because this has not only the face of Jesus, but it has the blood of Jesus. See? So it's a #1, first class relic. So that relic, of course, then becomes one of the most important of all the relics. In fact, if you made a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, they would give you a badge. This is called a veronicle. A veronicle means you have been to Jerusalem. because the number one thing to see in Jerusalem was the Veronica, to meditate on that. So if you got to the Veronica, let's say you came from Germany, you spent a month getting to Jerusalem, and then you have to wait. They would show it on Sundays and other days. Every Sunday, about 3 or 4 people died in the crush of people who were trying to get up to the Veronica. And you would say, well, why? Why did they bother? I'll tell you why they bothered. Because if you spent just 1 hour meditating on, looking at, admiring the Veronica, see, in other words, her name becomes the name of the handkerchief, yeah, then if
Her name is Greek, Veroniki, which means true image.
true image, right, which makes it like a little suspicious.
Yeah.
Right. But anyway, so if you came and just looked on it, if you just knelt and looked at it, you get 28,000 years out of purgatory.
Whoa. What a deal.
Yeah, what a deal. Except that the problem is 28,000 years, is that a lot or not much? Right? If you're in for $1 million, 28,000 is kind of like a drop in the bucket, right? So this was the thing, but they believed in this, right? So they made a pilgrimage just to see the Veronica. Well, one day, not a Sunday, but another day, they would occasionally, the Pope would just say, well, there's so many people want to see the Veronica, we'll let them in. So the news came to the camp. They were all camped on the other side of the river, of the Tiber, what's the river? No, the river in Rome. Tiber. No. And so they all had to cross this one bridge over the Tiber. And so many people got on it, it collapsed. And 197 people died trying to get to look at the Veronica, get time out of purgatory. So, yeah, that was not very successful. But the point is, there is one more that I want to mention, and you all know about this, so I won't dwell on it, and that is the Shroud of Turin. Now, one thing about the Shroud of Turin that we have to keep in mind is this: Jewish burial customs. Jewish burial customs were that the face would be wrapped with one piece of cloth, and then the rest of the body with another piece of cloth. The problem with this whole concept of the Shroud of Turin is it's all one piece. Now, whatever it is, it's an amazing piece of work, right? Because you see the image, and then when they learned how to do these 3D images, they could pull the image and you had this actual kind of face and so on. I think of those 3 relics, the Mendelian, the Veronica, and the Shroud of Turin, have to be on the all-star list of relics, right? Mm-hmm. Relics are, for them, were a very good and important thing. Now let me wrap it up by saying this. There was a huge industry of people selling relics. Now never mind the church declared this illegal, that didn't stop anybody. And people would pay extraordinary amounts of money for a relic. Or they would also pay money to go on these pilgrimages. And it's amazing, because if they could afford it, they would go to Jerusalem. Because if you could get to Jerusalem to the true cross, you wouldn't get just 28,000 years out of purgatory. You would have all of your sins forgiven up to that point. Every sin. And that kind of incentive was great. One of the reasons for the Crusades was to give people the opportunity to have that opportunity to get the indulgence. Because remember, what happened is that Jerusalem and the Holy Land was briefly closed, and so that closing of caused a great consternation among the people, because they wanted to get to Jerusalem to get that indulgence, the big one, right? If you read in the Canterbury Tales, the knight in there had been to Jerusalem many times. He had been to many pilgrimage sites all over Europe, North Africa, and he was either at a pilgrimage site or he's in a battle. I mean, this is amazing in a way. He's a holy man one day and a kind of a killer the next. That's the medieval mind. Saw no contradictions in the fact a man could be a gentleman and a warrior all at the same time. I mean, but how could you have these military orders like the Knights Templar? You know, these holy men, pacifists, very gentle, and then at the same time they were one of the greatest warriors who ever fought in the Crusades, right? Right. Okay, so I'm going to ask, before I wrap up right here, anybody have any question, anything I went over tonight? Yeah?
Oh, chivalry is
Hold on just a
French.
minute here.
Yeah,
Okay,
and that ties in with your talk, the word
Okay.
chivalry.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
hang on just a second.
We're gonna pause for
Thank you.
recognition.
Oh, I just mentioned, that came to mind chivalry, there are quite a few
Yeah.
words starting with C, of course you could go on and
Well,
on.
both chivalry and courtly love are tied
That's
together,
right.
and both of them, this is one of, again, history's ironies, that both of these come from Moorish Spain. This idea of treating the woman with great deference, this idea of, both in courtly love and chivalry. Chivalry is the idea that the knight, the noble, the aristocrat, right? The royals have to treat the common people real well, but most particularly women. In other words, they spend all of this effort, and that's, again, the Arthurian romances and the courtly love romances. These are all predicated on chivalry and this idea, this notion that women are to be held in great respect. And yet this can, you know, we think of, it's right there. We don't think of the Moors as great feminists, but in a way they were. This is ironic at that time.
This makes me think of the woman, the martyr that traveled with St. Paul.
Oh, yeah.
What was her name? I can't, starts with a C, doesn't it?
Mary the Egyptian.
Yeah, I can't think of it right
Yeah,
now.
okay.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Everything jumps out of my head all of a sudden. The transition from having a lot of different Roman gods to having a Catholic church with a lot of different saints.
Yes.
I'm assuming, I give you a comment on that.
Yeah.
And the other question I have is, you know, I was listening to a historian talk about Muhammad and how Muhammad really doesn't appear. His first historical reference is like 68 years
Yeah.
after, and this historian was saying that basically the Arab empire didn't rise out of a religion, but rather the religion was needed, so they created it to hold the empire together. I wonder if Constantine did the same thing, where he really produced the paradigm for feudalism.
Yeah.
And so if you could comment on that.
Well, Muhammad, of course, is a great enigma. We don't think of it this way very often, but Islam is very parallel to Christianity. There's lots of parallels to it. And there was a form of Christianity known as Nestorianism, which is, Nestorians were among the people that believed that Jesus was sent by God, but wasn't God, right? And so Nestorianism was very, very popular at one time. Well, anyway, Muhammad, when he was a young boy, he would be traveling with his uncle. You know, his mom died, his dad died, then the uncle that took it in died, and so then another uncle takes over taking care of him. So as a boy, he spends most of his life going back and forth from Baghdad, Mecca to Baghdad, Baghdad to Mecca, back and forth, carrying incense from the south, and then from the north, carrying many other products on that caravan trail. Well, anyway, they went by every time they made the trip. They went by this monastery in the desert. It's an Nestorian monastery. And one day, they never saw anybody. Remember, monks don't come out of the monastery. I mean, that's the whole point of being a monk. You know, you're close. One day, this monk came in and flagged him down. His name was Bahira. And Bahira said, "Excuse me for stopping you, but we would just be so greatly honored if you would come and have a meal with us in the monastery." Now, this is crazy to start with, right? Because monks don't invite people to come in to the monastery. Because the whole point of being in the monastery is separation from the world. But this is what happened. So they come in and they said, we'll be delighted to come and have a meal with you. So they get there and Bahira is getting ready to start. And but Bahira says, wait a minute, not everybody's here. And the uncle of Muhammad looks around and says, yeah, everybody's here. No, somebody missing. Well, there is a 10-year-old boy we left to watch the camels. Bahira says, bring him. So they go back and bring the young 10-year-old Muhammad. And when Bahira sees him, he says, yes, this is the one I want to see. This man, this young man will be a great prophet of his people. Okay? Now, let's say that story is completely legendary, but there's a point to the story, and it's this, that if you look with objective eyes at Islam, what you see is a religion that venerates Jesus, believes in the virgin birth, right? There's no other prophet that has that kind of thing. And when Muhammad made his night flight, you know, he flew, I guess you've heard this, that he flew to Jerusalem. You know who was there to meet him? 3 prophets. Abraham, Moses, and are you ready for this?
Jesus.
Thank you. And they 3 men offered him 3 drinks. They said, we offer you water, we offer you milk, and we offer you alcohol. And he says, well, can't do the alcohol. That's not good. And we also can't do water. That's the drink of the extremity. And so we're going to go the middle path. We're going to go with the milk. So he drinks the milk, and then he ascends. So magically appears this ladder, and he ascends into heaven, goes into the 7 heavens, and one of those heavens, each of the prophets has a heaven, but one of the heavens, of course, is the heaven of Jesus, right? So here's what's obviously thought of, is that Jesus is representing to them one of the great prophets, but not God. Muhammad is very, very, very clear on this point. There is no God but Allah. And this idea of 3 in 1 Trinity, I mean, you can't deal with that, right? But what do you have? You have the idea of a Savior coming that's going to save the world, right? The Mahdi. Right. And there's so many parallels between Christianity and Islam. What was your first question? It's been so long.
Just the transition from Roman gods to Catholic saints.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of work on this, but basically this is the essence of it. The Romans were used to worshiping many deities. So when Christianity comes along, there's a great need to be able to worship these gods who intervene with the big god, Zeus, right?
Right.
And so, hence, the cult of saints evolves for holy people, holy individuals who will have this ability to intervene with Mary and then Mary with God, right? And so I would say that, in a sense, it's kind of continuation of something that was very familiar to the Romans. And I don't believe that's far from the truth. it is in fact a, almost considered by many scholars, the idea that that is the true understanding of why Christianity succeeded, became, just went from being a very minor mystery religion nobody ever heard of to by the time of Constantine, before it becomes the official Roman religion, getting 25, 30, 35% of the people were Christian. That's extraordinary growth in a period of about 300 years. Yeah. So, good question. Yes?
Your talk was absolutely fascinating. Thank you. Do you mind if I ask if you're a Catholic?
No, I'm not a Catholic, but I have great respect for Catholicism.
Okay. One of my questions was, what were the dates of the Middle Ages? And
All right,
Relic
yeah.
and Constantine?
Yeah, this is a great question. I have seen every date you can imagine. Basically from 400 to about 1500 are the dates that are given. Some people, just to make it convenient, say 400 to 1400. Or they'll say from the fall of Rome to the rise of the Renaissance. But of course the Renaissance, is over a number of years. What I say is this, from St. Augustine, who died in 430, just as the Vandals are coming in and attacking the town of Hippo where he was. He could hear them, banging at the wall. So he was the last of the great church fathers, Augustine, to Martin Luther. Martin Luther, we think of as the man who started the Reformation and all this forward-looking thing, but in fact Martin Luther was always looking back to his greatest hero, except for Jesus, St. Augustine. See, St. Augustine was a man who Luther was trying to emulate. And Luther wasn't, are you ready? Augustinian friar. And he was always trying to bring back the true religion of St. Augustine. Augustine, by the way, was a bitter enemy of all relics. He did not believe in the relic business. And Luther's also theology is entirely based on the theology of St. Augustine. Now, I only mention that because the Middle Ages, if you look at Luther, it's not looking forward but looking back. And here's St. Augustine at the very end of the Roman. It's about 1100 span there. And I believe, in many ways, that's a good definition of the Middle Ages. But it's, again, take your pick. It's a personal thing. Any more questions? Yeah.
I have one.
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
But, also, I think there's relics of saints. I mean, you said we're talking about
Yeah.
first class, second class,
Yeah.
relation to Jesus, but
Yeah.
saints, did they follow the same first, second, and third class relics?
Yeah, so the term saint becomes an official term in Roman Catholicism. So you have to be officially approved, to be a saint. But originally, it was just a very, very holy man. Now, when the Reformation came along, then that all changes. Any Christian is by definition a saint. See, that's John Calvin in the flesh. So that's another great question. Yes, sir, please.
Do you know where the word devil in the English language comes from?
Do not.
Would you like to?
Yes.
It actually comes from the thinking of the French upper class. They had a very highly divided class system of the very wealthy who lived in La Cité, the city,
Yes.
and the very poor who lived in the country, the peasants who lived in Le Ville, the village. And whenever there was an idea or a thing or whatever that the upper class looked down upon, they would say, oh, that's de ville, of the village. From that comes devil in the English language.
Yeah. So the city, even then, was a devil thing. And by the way, the word pagan refers to the people that live in the country. So that's the opposite, where they're looking down, the city people are looking down at the country people. That's gone back and forth forever. Yes, go ahead.
Would you like to know where the word stubborn comes from?
Yeah, I guess I don't know.
Okay. Anglo-Saxon term meaning stump, S-T-A-U-B, which I think it follows German would be pronounced Staub. And that meant stump, the hardest thing in the world to move.
Ah, right, that's very good. Go ahead.
Carl Jung became a Catholic.
Oh, really?
I believe, yeah, I'm quite certain of that, and I believe he did it because the Catholics included, he felt that the Godhead, as defined by Christianity, lacked the feminine.
Yes.
And he said that the Catholics came as close as possible
Yes.
to including the feminine in the Godhead.
Yes.
And I know, and I think the Catholics are the only one that revere Mary to the extent that we do.
I think
I'm
that's
just
true.
curious if you could comment on that, or if you hadn't commented on it.
Well, I think that there's a kind of a brilliance in that, because by bringing in Mary, you have somebody who can speak to God, and it has this idea, by the way, in Catholic theology, that Mary, didn't die. She was just assumed into heaven again, because that would be most appropriate for her. And it's
Only assumption.
yeah, I get it. Assumption station. But the question of how effective this has been is because the Catholics have also had this tension, right? In other words, women cannot be priests. Women cannot enter into the holy vocation at that level. Women always have to be in a separate world and cloistered away. And you don't see many Catholic holy women get out of that. Now, there's a famous exception in the Middle Ages. That's Hildegard of Bingen. And now there's a lady. Ooh, she did a lot of very, very interesting things. But I would say few and far between. Very famous Catholic lay person by the name of Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor of Aquitaine, the queen of 2 countries, the mother of 3 kings. Eleanor of Aquitaine. But here's the important detail. Eleanor of Aquitaine is the one who introduced courtly love into France, and then when she became Queen of England, and drew courtly love into England. Yes, thank you, ma'am.
Courtly what?
Courtly love. Our entire system of relationships between men and women today is based on courtly love. Here, they used to call it, up until about 100 years ago, they called it courting, right? Now we say dating, but courting. Courting is the idea that you go to the male goes to the female, right? And before this time, all relationships were arranged. All marriages were arranged, right? But because of courtly love, it's about the relationship between these people. Now, at court, you got to remember, at court, they didn't have a damn thing to do, right? It was illegal for them to work. So they have all the money that they ever need. They have all the power. They have all prestige. But what can they do? What do they have? What can they spend their time doing in the Middle Ages, in this feudalistic structure? So what they do is entertain each other. So they travel from castle to castle to castle, and it's all the same group of people. They're all interrelated and intermarried, and blood relationship. And so the idea was, courtly love is that you have a special relationship. If you're a man in court, you have a special relationship with a particular woman at court, and that is, of course, the one. Now, it was both platonic and non-platonic. That is to say, Sometimes it was a physical relationship, sometimes it was not. But all of it is caught up in this idea of, you know, what you see at Valentine's Day, this idea of men, you know, bending over backwards for the female, to get the female's attention, to get the female to be worthy, right? That's where the chivalry comes in, to be worthy, to do all these good things. And this became an obsession. And so eventually the middle class start practicing courtly love. And then ultimately, courtly love just becomes de rigueur. Everybody practices courtly love. And if you had a person come back from before the time of courtly love, and you were talking to this person, let's say they were from the year 1000. So tell me about your culture, you know, how do you do things? And you say, well, you know, it's always been the same. Men and women will date for a while, and then the woman is the one who is really doing the picking, and she'll look at these various men, and then she'll eventually choose one, and then they get married. And the person from the year 1000 said, "You're kidding. You let the woman decide? You know, couldn't be." We had the right idea. We had arranged marriages. The parents pick out your partner. They know who's best for you, and it worked. Now tell me, how does the system you have here in 2018, how does this system work? Well, not so good, really. What do you mean? Well, about half of those marriages going through the toilet. Oh, really? Well, then what about the kids? Well, this is embarrassing, but more than half the kids born in the United States today have no father of record. And you go on with this system. This is the superior system. And you say, well, now that you've mentioned it, it really doesn't work very well. But it's all done in the name of what? Individual freedom and love and romance. See, romance comes from to do it like the Romans did it. See, in the Middle Ages, in courtly love, they imagined this is what the Romans did, and which I don't think is the case. And but Roma backwards means amor, which is love. And so this is just where we are today. Now, after Christmas, what are the next two biggest holidays? Valentine's Day and Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving is pretty big, I have to admit. But in terms of money spent, it's Mother's Day and Valentine's Day in terms of money spent, right? Which maybe that isn't the best gauge, but anyway, think about this a minute, if you will, please. Mother's Day. So much money is spent. You can't get into a restaurant. You can't even get a reservation in a restaurant. People call their moms and gifts and flowers and it's huge. It's huge and getting bigger. And yet it's only just a little over 100 years old. Started with a lady named Ann Jarvis in West Virginia. And she said, we're going to have a service for the mothers on one Sunday at our Methodist church. So then the next town over said, well, we got to do that for the guys. So the first Sunday in June, Father's Day. And that's how it got started. So Father's Day
Not as much money spent though.
Right. Father's Day gets smaller and smaller. Mother's Day gets bigger and bigger. And it's like you can walk into any restaurant in Dallas and, the whole place. You can have the whole thing. Don't worry about a reservation. Okay? Now, I'm being a little facetious, of course, but the fact of the matter is, maybe eventually Father's Day goes away, all the way. It's just about mothers. And I have a friend who's kind of wit. He says, eventually they'll call it sperm donor day.
Wow.
What was the Fourth Crusade and why is it important?
Let me think, is that the one that St. Francis was involved in? No, Fourth Crusade.
Tell him, John.
That's when the Roman Catholics attacked Byzantium.
Oh, yes, of course. And sacked the city.
Yeah.
And then it was downhill for Byzantium from then on.
Because
Well, because they didn't like their version of Catholicism.
they stole the shroud.
Ah, so they got it, that's when they got it back, right? Yeah.
Who got what back?
That's when it went back to Turin.
No, sir. No, it had been with the Orthodox all that time.
Yeah, right.
It had been with Constantine
Correct?
in Byzantium, Constantinople.
Mhm.
And Turin is just where it ended up, where it was discovered.
Yeah, well, that's,
Later.
right, but
After it was sold.
it's in the west. It's brought to the west and moves around for a while.
Right, but the Byzantine Empire lost the shroud. And then
Well, and nobody cared about anything about the shroud until they did that first black and white photo and looked at the negative. Then all of a sudden, that, gets so popular all over the
But
world.
see, actually, it was brought out every, several times a year in the big cathedral there in Hagia Sophia
In Constantinople.
in Constantinople. Yes, it was highly respected there.
Oh, yeah, right, very good, thank you. Go ahead.
Talk about when they sacked Byzantium, or the city of Constantinople.
Yes.
It was it had for 800 years, it had been accumulating trade and treasure. It was one of the largest and wealthiest cities in the world
Correct.
at a time like that. So they were just itching to get their hands on it, and they utterly plundered the city
Yeah, of course.
and stole virtually everything. And they occupied it for about 50 years, and then they left, and it was just a hollow shell of its former self. And it never recovered.
Actually, they lost it in 2 months.
So 2 months,
They
yeah.
were only able to hold it for 2 months.
But 50 years later, it was conquered by the Turks and became Istanbul.
Right. Yeah, 1454, I believe, is when the Turks, Ottoman Turks.
And the Ark of the Covenant, is that held, some group has it in a
Yeah.
church, a Byzantine church? Or
No, Ethiopia.
Ethiopia,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, the Ark of the Covenant, of course, this would be the great prize, if anybody ever found it. But it's made of wood, decorated with gold, so it's quite unlikely that it survived at all. But depending on who you talk to, the people believe it's under where the temple was in Jerusalem. And the traditional hiding place was under the women's court in the temple. And but it makes sense to me they would have tried to save it. So I think they did save it, but the problem is wherever they hid it, being wood, over time, it would likely disintegrate. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Did you know that in Scandinavia during the Viking times that the women ruled the villages?
I did
And the
know.
men said, yes ma'am.
Yeah.
There were queens and no kings.
Yeah.
And that's probably why they built all the ships and sailed the hell away.
Okay.
Secondly, you talked about the setting aside of a day to honor mothers
Yes.
and to honor fathers. Well, there's not one for daughters, but you've left out the most popular one for honoring sons. Sunday.
Sunday. Every Sunday. Yeah, very good. Love those play on words. Okay.
I take it you're not familiar with Ron Wyatt.
Well, I have heard his name.
Well, he's an archaeologist, and he's got a story about how he found the Ark of the Covenant underneath, in a cave underneath where Jesus was crucified.
Ah,
And his website's like ronwyatt.com, but
Okay.
it'd be an interesting story to investigate.
yeah. Well, I was very close friends with Bendel Jones, who spent 40-some years looking for the Ark of the Covenant. And his story, of course, was turned into a screenplay that was eventually accepted by Spielberg and Lucas. And his name, Bendel Jones, they took the name, they took off the V, they took off the L, the Indy. and so they called him Indy Jones or Indiana Jones. And he had spent a lot of time looking for the ark and believed he was in the right place at the time of his death. He had found many things from the temple in this cave of the columns where he was doing archaeological work. But he had a love-hate relationship with the Israeli government, and they'd let him dig, and they'd tell him he can't dig anymore. And, you know, basically, I think they didn't want, even though he was an Israeli citizen, they really didn't want him to make such a great discovery. They wanted it to go to an Israeli. That's my take on it, yes.
Now, one of the things between the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholic Church is Rome had a problem when it came to Jerusalem. Is they wanted their pilgrims to go to their churches, but the Orthodox churches were already there. And
Right.
the Orthodox Church of the Holy Sepulchre is a completely different site than the Holy Sepulchre Church of the Romans.
Crusaders Church, yeah.
And so, anyway, it was underneath the Orthodox Church, not Holy Sepulchre, I'm sorry, where Golgotha.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Anyway, the church there at Golgotha
Yeah,
was...
it's called the Gordon's Calvary. It's a place where, you know, where they found the...
Anyway, I met Vendel. I used to go over to
Oh,
his
yeah,
place sometimes.
yes, I remember.
And listen, I don't know if I ever met you there, but...
Well, we did, but, you know, didn't realize it maybe at the time
Okay.
and so on,
Yeah.
yeah.
And so anyway, Ron Wyatt actually found his discovery of the Ark is underneath that site.
Ah, that's interesting, because the Golgotha is not ever mentioned as a possible site.
Yeah.
But that would make it kind of very insignificant.
It actually gets to be very eerie when you hear all the
Yeah.
details. It's
Yeah,
really something else.
Did Vendel know of him?
You know, Vendel really did his own thing, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, we'd all say that.
We would all say that.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm behind you.
Yes.
My understanding is that they did carbon dating on the shroud, and it was 1100 to 1200.
Yeah.
So,
And there's never been a scientific investigation that's been more controversial than that one, because they said they sampled a patch. You know, it had been patched up over the years, and they sampled a patch which had been put on in the Middle Ages. So,
After fire.
Yeah, after
They
a
never
fire.
really did the rest of it.
Yeah, and they didn't date the rest of it. So it didn't settle the question, it just made it
More
more
controversial.
controversial all the way around. Yes, sir.
I've heard they found deficiencies in the carbon dating system, so
That
it
too.
may not be all that valid
That
as
too.
it was once believed that it was.
And that's also part of it.
Yeah.
But there is just, the divide is great. So we have all these books being written for and written against. Yeah.
The question I have for you is, after all this inculcation of knowledge and belief value systems,
Yeah.
what would be the essence of the gist of the germaneness of the protein concept of your own belief value system that you have managed to glean or synergize from all these things you study?
Well, that's a huge answer, so I'll give you a very short answer. I learned this, that religion and culture cannot be separated, that they are totally together. And so to say that one religion is right, another religion is wrong, this is nuts. What you have to say is the religion is a reflection of the culture, and the culture and the culture is a reflection of the religion. And you can't ever separate those two.
Right.
So I believe that when you study Western civilization, for example, and you just say, well, we're not going to do the Reformation, we're not going to do Calvin or Luther because they were religious guys, and we're just studying the culture. That's nuts. That's completely wrong.
Right.
See, because you can't really ever totally separate those two. So my answer is that if you're going to presume to be a neutral observer of these things, you can't arbitrarily say these people are right and these people are wrong. You've already taken sides. So I try not to take sides. I have my own personal beliefs. Now, if a student every once in a while asks a question, so what's your religion? Now, if I'm asked directly what I believe, personally, what my religion is, I'll answer it. But it's my job as a teacher to try to be a neutral observer and try to bring out both sides and try to look at things objectively. I get asked to do these programs, say, on Islam, because they what they basically want to hear is, how evil Islam is. Well, I won't do that, because it isn't any religion that's good or bad, it's how people interpret it, right? I mean, if you looked at Christianity for the 200-year period of the Crusade, you'd say that's the worst religion ever invented. It causes all these people to go and murder all these people, you see? So I try to be objective. It's hard though, believe me, very hard. Okay. Anything else?
I think that's it. You got
Thank you.
Now it's your turn to talk, so anybody here wants to get up here and you got 5 minutes to whatever you want to say. Only 5 minutes. Either for or against what our speaker has to say.
Well, I think one of the things that it might be good to view all these different historical events in Christianity would be to view them as power plays. Because you had Constantine coming along and making a power play by getting the religion to define itself. All of a sudden, many Christians at that time all of a sudden became heretics. So, but see, for the purposes of his empire, you were either in or you were out.
Right.
And many of the Christians at that time, if our speaker has studied anything about the Desert Fathers,
Oh, yeah.
the Desert Fathers basically said, Christianity has died this day that Constantine has made it the religion of the empire. And many left that's where the monasteries really came from. Many of the men left for the deserts, and the women's cloistered inside the cities. And the women cloistered inside the cities. So that's an important point. One of the other things that needs to be emphasized is that Constantine really was accomplishing something that Rome had wanted to do for a long time, and that was to de-Hebrewize this new thing called Christianity, because Constantine did not want people going on pilgrimage to Jerusalem, the city that the Romans destroyed. He wanted them to be coming to his new empire there in Byzantium at Constantinople, which also is a very interesting thing, because the reason Constantine moved from Rome, which was the seat of the Caesars, was because he said that the new religion, Christianity, would never be able to flourish under the shadow of the Roman gods in Rome. So when you had the Fourth Crusade, what you really were seeing there is you were seeing that Rome sensed that Byzantium was weakened, and I'll take exception to the speaker's view of the Crusades. Islam, someone did some figures, and they figured that Islam in its illustrious history has been responsible for the deaths of around 270 million people in their various conquests. And either you converted or you died in many cases. And then in other areas, they became more liberal. Once they were in the seats of power, in India especially, they liberalized. But you found it was just an incredible political move by Islam, and they were literally at the gates of Vienna at one point, and very nearly got all of Europe. And they did get a big part of Spain. In fact, was it all of Spain for a while?
Almost.
Almost all of Spain.
Almost.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's one thing that has to be looked at as, you know, religions as political entities. And so, when you had the Fourth Crusade, Rome basically was coming in, and they were telling all their people, we're going to go take it back from the Greeks. Well, you know, many years before it had been a Greek colony when Constantine moved there, but all of the relatives of the people who were attacking, they're all blood relatives there. So it's not all that many centuries separated from when they're attacking. So Rome was working to get the crown of the Caesar back, and that's a whole big issue as far as, you know, the politics going on. Now, you talk of Martin Luther. Martin Luther looked at the crimes of the Roman Catholic Church and wished to remedy many of those things. Well, what he did essentially is he said the authority is not in the clergy, it's not in the Pope, it's not in the cardinals, it's not in any of these people, it's in the book. But we really only had printed Bibles since the 1500s, so I mean it's one of those things that you really could not have accomplished before that time. Again, a political move. So when we are looking at what we have as Christianity, I really value the work of ancient languages scholars like Michael Heiser, who goes back and he looks, what did the apostles think, what was in their mind at the time when these things were happening and when they're being written about, and get into that early mind, which is very Hebrew and related to all these different factors of the Mosaic Law and so forth like that. That's all worked in there, and by the time we get to today, we've been very Romanized. And so it's, again, I would say, if you could take politics out of it, and if you could have the right template, the right filter to filter out, you know, what is real, what is not real, and all this, it'd be a very interesting thing, and I think something very valuable you could turn up with.
Another interesting aspect of relics is what the Bible says about them, which our speaker didn't go into very much, but if you read the book of Acts, there are passages in there where it talks about, like Paul's handkerchief or Peter's handkerchief would be taken to someone and laid on and they'd be healed, or Peter's shadow passing over someone would heal them, or something like that. And I've also read some really interesting stories about miraculous things happening with relative to the veil of Veronica. So, you know, as long as you have some biblical references to things like that, where you actually have miraculous events happening as a result of a quote-unquote relic, I don't think that nature of relics is ever going to go completely away. It's just a really interesting question, I guess, and that's just another aspect to investigate about these relics.
One once again, I want to thank the speaker. It just gave such a broad, pulled together so many things, getting big ideas. I had a little bit of reflections when he spoke about touching, and I heard a speaker recently on the radio talking about murderophilia and people buying objects that are connected with murders. And it made me think of the power of touch. And I know when the funeral for George Bush was recently, they had a picture of one of his good friends that was a senator, and as the casket came down the aisle, he leaned way over and he touched it and left his hand there for a long time. And that image stuck in my mind. Touching the casket was so important to him. And I thought, I guess sometimes maybe it's a reminder of, it is powerful in a sense that that person made an impression on you. And that's powerful, the impression that they made. So, I don't know, just a little bit of reflections about touching relics. And then I wanted to share something. I have been going to some of the philosophers' forums, and the speaker that talked about the Nazis' philosophy said that basically they were, in the extermination of the Jews, they were trying to eliminate innocence and conscience. Did you understand that, Ken, to some degree? He was saying that they were called the chosen people. So they had to be gotten rid of because they reminded people that there's a conscience and there's a good and a bad, and they wanted to be able to do whatever they wanted to do without any repercussions or consequences. So when the speaker talked about the sword being captured, that just reinforced that in my mind, that he's eliminating conscience. And they killed the children first because the children were innocent. They wanted to eliminate innocence and conscience. Thank you.
Dr. Benson, you always give lectures that are just so filled with so much research. They're fascinating. Speaking about relics and so forth, I think one of the most important movies ever made was The Matrix, because it illustrated the fact that, which I believe to be true, that this sense of material existence is illusion. And every relic, which is a material object, holds us down into a material belief. And it's not the object that has any power at all, it's our belief in it that has the power. Because the kingdom of heaven, folks, is within you. And that's the only place you have to look for all the answers that we need for anything in life. At Harvard University years ago, I remember reading about this, some guys wanted to do an experiment, and they blindfolded the guy and tied him to a chair, and they rubbed something sharp on his arm. They didn't actually cut it, but they told him that they did, and that he was bleeding, and they were going to bleed him to death, and they dripped lukewarm water on him, and he died without bleeding one drop.
Whoa.
The belief did it. They weren't too happy about that, but they learned a lesson. Another thing with belief, I remember I was driving I've mentioned this before, in the car in the 60s listening to the radio. A German paratrooper had gone out of an airplane at 3,500 feet for a practice jump over Rhein-Main Air Force Base outside of Wiesbaden. His chute didn't open, and he landed right smack in the middle of the concrete runway. Well, we know what the beliefs, the so-called laws of physics and physiology would say about that. Well, that evening when the astonished reporters were interviewing him, sitting up alertly in his hospital bed with his one broken leg and a bunch of bruises and no other internal or external injuries, they said, "How in the world did you survive that fall?" And he said, "Well, our instructor taught us how to land right. I knew how to land right. I knew I was going to land right, and I knew I was going to survive." And that thought, with all of the energy he put behind it, which was every bit he had, determined the outcome of his future in those instances, in those minutes. They are not laws, physics and physiology. The concepts we hold of people are very important. I remember two different testimonies that I heard. One woman was walking home at night late, and she had to go through an alley that was dark, and she noticed she was being followed by a man, and she, of course, had the immediate sense of fear and all that, but she said, "No, I'm not going to fall into that trap. I am going to see man made in the image and likeness of God, divine love, and that is that man following me." And she held to that. She went around, got on the sidewalk, and had a little stairway up to the level where a door was, got up to the top and turned around and looked at him and said, "What do you want?" And he said, "Well, ma'am, when I first started following you, I meant to do you harm, but as we walked along, I just wanted to see that you got home safely." Turned around and walked away.
Wow.
It's all within our own consciousness. If we choose not to accept the aggressive mental suggestions that are all around us, don't choose to stay in the matrix. Another woman stopped at a stoplight. A man jumped in her car with a weapon and made her drive out in the country and said he was going to rape her and all of that. She did exactly the same thing, and not accepting what he believed to be his identity, but seeing him as the man made in the image and likeness of God. And they got out there and they talked for about a half an hour, and eventually he said, "Well, I am so sorry I've done this to you, but I'm grateful for what you've taught me. Would you please just drive me back to the police department? I have a couple more things I need to straighten out." It just goes on and on. Otto Bismarck was a remarkable man. I'm glad you brought him up. He made a statement that the experiment being carried out in the United States of America may hold the hope of humanity for the future. He was, I thought, a very brilliant man. He stopped all the warring tribes in that area and joined them all together and had them create what's called High German, Hochdeutsch, out of all these different dialects. And he made one language in one country. The joining of Austria and Hungary in World War II. In World War I, Austria, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Germany had a mutual defense treaty. And when the Serb radicals came over and assassinated Archduke Ferdinand and his wife, the Austro-Hungarians were enraged, and so they ran an army over into Serbia, not realizing that Serbia had a mutual defense treaty with Russia, so Austro-Hungarian Empire was attacked by Russia, who had a mutual defense treaty with Germany. They had to attack Russia, who had a mutual defense treaty with France and England, and pretty soon everybody was in a war that nobody wanted. And Germany was a very upstanding, progressive, fine part of Europe. And then everybody thought that war was going to be over in a couple of weeks. I remember reading about some English soldiers who were getting on the train saying, "Bye, Mom, this won't last long. We'll be back in about 2 weeks." Well, 4 years later, France had lost 10% of their population, which was a whole generation of young men. And the whole of Europe was just in a huge state of trauma. And they blamed it all on Germany. It wasn't Germany's fault. Germany was attacked by its own allies. If anybody had had any sense at that point, they would have joined Germany against Russia. But no, all these mutual defense treaties meant that it had to just bring the world into a state of hell, really. Well then, because of the bitterness of the French and the English. They blamed it all on Germany, and they cut out parts of Germany and gave them to Poland and Czechoslovakia, which were German people who were treated like hell under their rule for the next, 2 decades. And Hitler came along and said, look, he told the world this, he said, we're going to get those German people back into Germany. Now, we want to do it through negotiations, but if not, we're going to bring the military in there. Those two countries would not negotiate, so they took the military in there. And naturally, those two countries attacked them militarily, so they were at war with Poland and Czechoslovakia. And the evening of the day that Winston Churchill was appointed Prime Minister, he ordered the bombing of German cities. They weren't in the war zone, men, women, and children. So naturally, Hitler felt betrayed there, because you can find it on YouTube, it is still there. Several speeches in which he said that he felt that Great Britain was essential to peace in Europe, and if they were ever attacked by an enemy, Germany would come to their defense. Felt totally betrayed. And I'm not a Hitler fan, and all of this thing that happened with the Holocaust and so forth, I think there's a whole lot of other history than what the books tell us about that. But I think after the assassination attempts on him and the betrayals and so forth, I think that he got mentally deranged, frankly. I don't think he ever wanted a war. From what I have read, when he went to war with Russia, it was because he saw the communist, international communism, coming in with a huge army out of Russia in its weakness to conquer all of Northern Europe, which they probably would have done. And Germany sent an army out there and hit them on the flank and turned around that invasion, and they stopped that from happening. And that cost them everything. I mean, there's so much more to history than we're taught, and I think that it's great that people like you do such research like you do. This has been a very, very enlightening presentations. Now, I think, John, you mentioned the Muslim invasion of Vienna, when they had Vienna circled. They thought Vienna was going to fall. And then Prince, I forget his name, of Poland brought his army, and that saved them. And the bakers in Vienna at the time knew that this man loved horses and had lots of horses and loved to ride horseback. And the term for a stirrup was something like Bügel in German. And so from that, the bakers made the bagel that we have today. And there was the crescent on the Arab flag. And so the German bakers made the croissant for that also. And they were working at night making food for the whole city, and they heard the Arabs digging underground, and they saved the city by telling the authorities what they were hearing. Lots of interesting things in history. Is it 5 minutes?
Oh, it's 10 minutes.
It's 10 minutes?
Yeah.
Well, darn it, it's too little.
Thank you very much, that was great, really appreciated it. And what I always say before I say anything else is that I haven't found a conspiracy theory I don't like, so you have to put that. But basically we're talking about mothers and fathers, and I kind of believe that there is a group, however we define it, that's trying to socially engineer society. And one of the things I noticed, I think about, if you want to do that, you certainly want to disrupt the family. And so as we talked about mothers and fathers, you know, we talk about gay people and lesbians and homosexuals and trans this and trans that. And I don't think that's so much what the point is, you know, God bless all these people, but I think the point is that we no longer, you know, venerate parents. You know, here are these people who give a tremendous amount of time and treasure to raise these kids so that they can, you know, carry on civilization. And I think mothers, perhaps, and maybe more than fathers, they teach their children how to become human beings. And I think I think that's sort of their job. Maybe the fathers are certainly participate too, but everybody knows that a mom is just that special person. I can't quite capsulize it. But in any event, when I see this, that's just something I've noticed. I think this whole thing about all these different sexual types is really a means to stop talking about the importance of family and the importance of good parents. Thanks.
Make it short, we're running out of time.
Well, I just wanted to bring up that relics and reliquaries and saints are not just a thing of the Roman Catholic Church. The Orthodox Church has a long history and some very important shrines and so forth. There was St. Mary of Egypt, who was one lady who went out and lived in the desert, as the Desert Fathers did, highly venerated, and people experienced healings at the site of her shrine. There was St. Manas. During World War II, the Orthodox were praying to St. Manas, and there was a visionary thing where someone was seeing St. Manas walking through the German camp, and the Allied troops woke up and found one entire division of Germans had just lost their minds. They were just wandering around aimlessly, talking to themselves, and so that was considered by the Orthodox to be St. Manas helping them during the battles of World War II. My violin instructor, I was mentioning something about the Germans and talking about World War II, and my violin instructor got very serious, and he said, you need to understand, the Germans just do everything very well. They do things better. So the Bachs produced this wonderful music, and I mean, I study it, and I don't think I had quite as much respect for it. And then I started looking into it and seeing how they really took you through all these different musical expressions in the etudes and so forth. And then of course, you have their battle plan and how efficient they were in warfare. And then even the horrors of the Holocaust. It's just the Germans do things better, even evil.
I guess I'm the last one standing, so I want to thank our speaker for doing a great job here tonight. I thought he a lot of things that I never heard of before, which is great. You always learn something, and the association of words and different things there is really something. One of the things he brought up that struck me was how today we don't venerate our parents like they did back then, and that's part of the problem we have in our society. Well, I look at it a little differently. One of the things we have in our society, we have an 8-hour day now, and we really have about a 12-hour day because we spend 2 hours getting to and from work.
Yeah.
And so we're burning ourselves up and we're working ourselves to death, and it's not a good thing. And we're not educating our kids because we don't pay for education anymore in the higher education. We're leaving it up to them, and they're walking out with a lot of debt. Not a good thing. So we're running in the wrong direction when that comes to society and societal change. So personally, I think that maybe we need a 6-hour day instead of an 8-hour day. And that if we had a 6-hour day, we'd have more people working, paying taxes, we'd have less people not working, draining taxes. The government get a twofold benefit of increased tax revenue without raising taxes. We have less bills to pay for people who aren't working as they'd be working. Then that would be a better society. That way, more people, this would work. And automation does replace people with machines. Machines don't pay taxes. That's a general thing that's been going on since the Industrial Revolution, and it's accentuating today to that respect. Anyway, in order to do that, we have another problem though. If we did do that, our corporations all leave town and go where labor costs are cheaper because it would increase the labor costs. And so therefore what we need to do is put tariffs on corporations. American corporations left and went overseas. Apple is a classic example. And if they had to pay the difference in labor costs and transportation costs, they might consider producing here, at least what is sold here. Then you'd have jobs here and you could offshore, and if you move in that direction. Then you have another problem, that is our Congress. We have the best Congress money can buy. That's one of our problems. They're owned by the corporations and they won't vote against the corporations. So what can we do with them? Well, in my view, if maybe the last 90 days of a general election, they have free airtime, they vote for it. Why? Because they get to keep they get to keep the money they raise and they get free airtime. But of course the challenger would also get free airtime, and some challengers would beat some incumbents, then everything would change. It would represent the people who did the electing instead of representing the people buying their vote in Washington. Then you could put tariffs on corporations, then you could shorten the workday, then you could have a better society. And you'd have more time to watch your kids when you're not there because you'd be there. And that's what we're all about. So anyway, that's my thought, and I'd leave this up to our speaker. Yes. You got your comment on the comment, close meeting.
Now that I'm an older person, I reflect on what I've seen in my lifetime. There used to be a term we used 30 years ago called future shock. And future shock is so overwhelming in my life that sometimes I wonder how I've adjusted to the computer age, for example. The reason I mention this is because I would imagine if I could come back 1,000 years from now, and it would just be, I ask myself, I wonder if any church is left? I wonder if the family is left? I wonder what life is like 1,000 years from now. But I've come to the conclusion that the more things change, the more they stay the same. And you come back and you would recognize, there might not be very many churches, but there would be churches, there'd still be families, kids would still go to school, and they would be worried about the environment and the deterioration of the planet and all of that. But then I think, if you look way far ahead, we get so worried about this, that, and the other thing. There's going to be no planet Earth eventually, right? It's going to get incinerated when the sun finally implodes, and there will be very little left unless there's another civilization to record what we did, right? So everything that we're here looking at seems so permanent, right? Everything which we venerate and hold dear is all gone. So that's why I can't get too excited about these concerns that people have. Oh my goodness, what's going to happen with this and that and the other thing? In the end, it's all going to go away. And yet, does that mean it's pointless? Not necessarily at all. All that humans have learned and all the advances humans have made, they're important. But who are they important to? To us. See? So, if you live long enough, you'll see the opposite of what you saw when you started out. And yet, it's all part of a big circle, and it all keeps coming back around on itself. And so life is worth living, but at the same time, we have to be realistic about that we're very human-centric, right? It's all about us. And, but the universe, even the universe, as we know it, will completely change, and maybe it'll keep expanding until it's all gone. Who knows? But all we can say is, although we get closer to the truth, it's like the half-life. We get closer and closer, but in smaller and smaller increments of finding out what how the whole thing ticks, how the whole thing's put together. And so my advice to anybody is enjoy your life. Enjoy your life now. Try to find the middle path between being a person that contributes nothing to being a person who sacrifices everything. I think you should always try to enjoy life, but also find ways to contribute to each other. And that's all we have, because the earth will end in the future, but our lives are going to end. So for all intents and purposes, our reality is always on a very short leash, right? And we're not that far away from the end, so therefore, all we can do is appreciate what we have here and now. Thank you again for having me.
That's it for our formal meeting. Our speaker may kick us out here at 10:30, just so you know. And our speaker is here if you want to talk to him. And if anybody wants to take home some cake, let them know. We'll put it together, because there's quite a bit left over.